Hello and welcome, dear listener. Please set your volume to a gentle level, just enough for the words to drift softly into your ears. Close your eyes, lie still, and let go of the day's weight. Together, we begin to sink slowly into rest. Tonight, we start with the first story in our series of boring history for sleep, the monotony of Roman Senate debates. If you find comfort in these quiet stories, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can return each night and let history carry you into dreams. In the long corridors of Roman politics, the Senate stood as both a symbol of order and an endless source of routine. To imagine the Senate is not to picture fiery debates or sudden decisions, but to picture men in long robes walking slowly to their appointed seats, their sandals echoing softly against the stone floors, carrying with them scrolls of records, petitions, or complaints. The day began not with drama, but with the scraping sound of benches as senators arranged themselves in careful rows, and the presiding magistrate called the session to order in the same formula that had been used countless times before. A clerk would unroll a scroll, reading aloud decrees from the previous day, his voice steady and unchanging, like the drone of a distant instrument. Senators listened with half interest, many of them already knowing the contents. For these decrees were not new ideas, but repeated affirmations of procedures already agreed upon. Time moved slowly in this chamber, for the Senate was less a place of quick action and more a place of endless confirmation. The senators sat surrounded by the heavy architecture of the curia, walls plain yet solid, the high ceiling catching the faint echo of every voice. Even the flicker of oil lamps or the pale light filtering from above gave little warmth, leaving the hall feeling cool and dry, as though it resisted all emotion. The topics discussed were often administrative. Questions of provincial taxes, shipments of grain from Sicily, the appointment of minor officials to positions in far-off towns. Each matter required formality. The proposal would be read. The opinion of certain elder statesmen would be requested. Then a murmur of assent or a call for another reading, until eventually the matter was recorded and passed along. Nothing dramatic, nothing swift, only the slow turning of the bureaucratic wheel. Senators were required to sit through hours of such procedure, and many grew restless. Some shifted their robes, some leaned back and closed their eyes as though contemplating, but in truth, drifting between thoughts. Younger members, eager to speak, often waited weeks before being recognized. Their speeches rehearsed in their minds but delivered to a half-drowsy audience. The elder senators nodded solemnly, adding comments that repeated earlier points, as if the repetition itself carried authority. When disputes did arise, they were rarely settled by passion. Instead, they were drawn out over days, broken into subcommittees, delayed by the reading of precedent, until even sharp disagreements dulled into long processes. The atmosphere discouraged haste. Even matters concerning wars or the movement of legions could be weighed with long recitations of tradition, arguments about procedure, and careful references to past decisions. Hours stretched into afternoons into evenings, and still the discussions lingered. One could imagine a senator, after a long day, leaving the chamber with little sense of progress, only the feeling of having sat through a tide of words. The Senate was, in truth, a theater of endurance. What mattered was not who spoke the most cleverly, but who remained patient enough to last through the monotony. Outside, Rome bustled with merchants, soldiers, and citizens shouting in the forum. But inside the Senate, voices moved at a slower pace, deliberate and restrained. The contrast was striking. A visitor might expect power and fire from such a body, but what they would encounter was process, ceremony, and the dull rhythm of formality. Each day resembled the one before, and each session bled into the next, until the entire history of the Senate seemed less a sequence of great debates and more a collection of ordinary, repeated routines. When the senators gathered once again for another sitting, the sense of routine was immediate, for the ritual of entering the chamber had changed little in decades, and even the order of arrival followed an unspoken rhythm. The elder statesmen walked slowly, assisted by attendants, their faces set in lines of habit rather than anticipation, while the younger men carried their scrolls neatly tucked under their arms, eyes cast downward as if to remind themselves to appear solemn rather than eager. The scribes prepared the benches and rolled out the documents for the day, placing them on wooden stands so they could be read aloud with minimal effort. The presiding officer, often a consul or praetor, would begin by invoking the customary formulas, his voice steady and without emphasis, for it was never the role of such a figure to inspire, but merely to regulate. What followed was the long reading of financial accounts, provincial reports, and matters of taxation. Each line carrying numbers of shipments, totals of coin, records of expenditure, and debts owed, all intoned in the same tone as the previous day and the day before that. These lists were long, stretching into hours, until the sound of the clerk's voice became a constant background hum, like the steady turning of a wheel that no one could stop. Senators shifted uneasily, some adjusting their togas, some whispering in low voices to their neighbors, others simply staring at the high ceiling as if measuring the time by the fading light filtering through the upper windows. At intervals, a senator would rise to offer a comment, often beginning with a reference to tradition, citing precedents from earlier times, sometimes recalling the decisions of men long dead whose words were still used to anchor the present. Yet even these speeches were rarely new. They repeated familiar arguments about the fairness of tax rates, the burden on provincial towns, the responsibility of governors, the quality of roads and aqueducts. Listeners nodded not because they were persuaded, but because they had heard it all before, and agreement was easier than contest. Occasionally, a murmur of dissent would stir, yet even this dissent was bound by formality, expressed politely, followed by long citations from law, until the energy of protest dulled into further repetition. The minutes passed, the scrolls continued to be read, and still the chamber remained locked in its rhythm. Outside, one might imagine the cries of market sellers, the stamping of hooves, the rumble of carts on stone streets, but within these walls there was only the voice of procedure. The Senate prided itself on order, and order meant slowness, care, and endless confirmation. Even when decisions were finally reached, they were often temporary, subject to revision the following week, or postponed for further consideration, so that no matter how long the day had lasted, the sense of conclusion was faint. By the time the presiding officer signaled the end of the session, the senators rose with the stiffness of men who had sat too long, gathering their robes and papers, speaking in low tones as they filed out, knowing that the next day would bring the same motions, the same voices, the same reading of decrees. There was no climax, no decisive moment, only the ongoing current of procedure that seemed as eternal as the stones of the Curia itself. The following session of the Roman Senate unfolded in a manner so familiar that it seemed almost indistinguishable from the gatherings that had preceded it, for the routines were ingrained into the very structure of the institution, and the senators themselves had long surrendered to the predictable flow of its proceedings. The day began with the quiet shuffling of feet along the marble corridors, the faint creak of wooden doors opening, and the soft murmur of men exchanging greetings in low, restrained tones, as if loud voices might disturb the solemnity of the chamber. The scribes and attendants had already prepared the benches, placing scrolls neatly in rows, while ink and wax tablets rested close at hand for the recording of decisions that would later be copied and stored in archives few would ever consult. Once again, the presiding magistrate recited the customary opening, invoking the authority of tradition more than the urgency of the present moment, his tone measured and unvaried. The agenda, long and heavy, included reports from distant provinces, updates on grain shipments, questions regarding the maintenance of aqueducts, petitions from local magistrates seeking approval for minor expenditures, and the endless matter of taxation, which returned like the tide, never resolved completely, always resurfacing with new figures to consider. The clerk's voice droned steadily as each line was read, listing the totals of bushels, the numbers of livestock, the weights of goods transported, the names of towns that owed or had paid their dues. The sound was monotonous, the meaning blurred into a stream of data, and yet formality required that it all be spoken aloud, entered into record, acknowledged by those present. Senators sat with their hands folded, some staring blankly ahead, others whispering behind sleeves, their eyes glazed as they endured the slow pace of administrative life. When a senator stood to speak, the effect was not one of sudden interest, but of prolongation, for speeches rarely brought novelty. Rather, they rehearsed the same themes: the importance of frugality, the need for fairness, the example of the ancestors, the dangers of excess. Each argument circled back to principles already repeated many times before, and so the chamber seemed to move in circles, advancing without progress, speaking without conclusion. Younger senators occasionally attempted to inject energy, but their words were tempered by the decorum expected of the setting, and their eagerness was soon absorbed into the rhythm of the chamber. The elders, by contrast, relished the slowness, for delay itself was a form of control, ensuring that no rash decision could disrupt the balance of custom. As hours passed, the oil lamps flickered and shadows stretched across the walls, yet the voice of the clerk, the mutter of speakers, and the murmur of assent continued, unbroken by urgency. Outside the curia, the forum still echoed with life, merchants calling to buyers, advocates pleading cases, children chasing one another through the colonnades. But inside the Senate, time thickened, its flow reduced to the cadence of repeated readings and formal replies. When the presiding officer finally brought the session to a close, the senators rose slowly, adjusting their robes, collecting their scrolls, exchanging brief remarks that carried no more weight than the debates they had sat through. They departed one by one, their footsteps fading into the corridors, leaving behind a chamber unchanged. A record of decisions that seemed less like commands and more like confirmations of what had already been expected. The monotony was not an accident but a feature, for the Senate valued the appearance of stability above the speed of action, and so each gathering became less an event and more a ritual, a ceremony of continuity, where the real substance was the endurance of the process itself. The next meeting of the Roman Senate carried on with the same measured rhythm, the kind of rhythm that felt less like a moment in history and more like a repetition of countless days that had come before, for the institution thrived not on novelty, but on predictability, and every man who entered the chamber knew what to expect long before the clerk's voice began to echo. The curia, with its high ceiling and heavy stone walls, absorbed the faint sounds of sandals against the floor as senators filed in, arranging themselves with deliberate slowness, greeting one another with nods and murmurs rather than animated conversation, for this was not a place for sudden movements or bursts of excitement. The benches creaked as the men settled, and attendants moved quietly in the background, adjusting lamps, unrolling scrolls, arranging tablets and styluses, preparing for a day that promised little more than the endless reading of records. The presiding magistrate rose and, as always, spoke the formula that had been spoken thousands of times before, invoking the authority of the Republic, reminding the chamber of its duties, though his tone revealed no urgency, only the calm insistence of custom. Once this ritual had ended, the day's agenda was announced, beginning with the presentation of correspondence from governors in far-flung provinces. Reports from Africa detailed the shipment of grain, its weight measured carefully, its arrival dates noted with precision, its transport expenses recorded in detail. Reports from Gaul concerned the collection of taxes, the numbers of cattle registered, the quantities of wine produced, and the disputes between local tribes about their obligations. Each line was read slowly, without flourish, the clerk's voice steady as a metronome, and though the senators had little to add, each report had to be acknowledged, entered into record, and preserved for posterity. Hours passed as the words continued, the hall filled not with argument, but with the steady current of administrative information. When discussion finally arose, it was rarely about policy, and more often about the procedure of acknowledgement, whether a report had been copied correctly, whether a seal had been affixed properly, whether the messenger had followed the correct path of transmission. Even small irregularities could occupy the chamber for long stretches of time, as senators debated not the substance of grain or cattle, but the technicalities of how such matters had been recorded. A young senator, eager to demonstrate his knowledge, might stand and deliver a speech about the need for diligence, recounting examples from earlier centuries when lax record-keeping had led to disputes, and his words would be received with solemn nods. Though everyone knew they merely repeated lessons already well known, the elders often responded with reminders that the ancestors had insisted upon precision, citing lines of law and examples of famous magistrates who had delayed decisions until every detail had been verified. And so the day crept onward, not with resolution, but with careful pauses, as if the chamber's true purpose was not to act, but to prevent error through endless repetition. Outside the walls, time moved quickly, merchants made sales, soldiers marched, children laughed, but within the Senate, time slowed to the pace of the clerk's monotone voice and the turning of scrolls. As the lamps burned lower, shadows lengthened, and still the same matters were repeated. The same phrases entered into the record, the same gestures of assent given. By the end, when the presiding magistrate finally declared the session adjourned, the senators departed without haste, their faces calm, their robes flowing in silence, as if leaving a place of worship rather than a place of power. What remained was not memory of decisions or moments of passion, but the impression of continuity, the sense that the Senate would reconvene again the next day, and the next, always repeating, always circling, always caught in the monotony that was its very essence. The following day, the Roman Senate assembled once more, and as always the rhythm of entry, seating, and procedure unfolded with such regularity that it seemed less like the choice of individuals and more like the movement of a mechanism that had long been set in motion, for each senator took his place without variation, each attendant carried out his task without need of instruction, and each voice in the chamber seemed to follow a path that had been walked so many times that it no longer required thought. The morning light filtered faintly through the upper openings of the curia, falling in pale rectangles across the floor, where the dust stirred only slightly as men adjusted their robes. The presiding magistrate rose with slow dignity, reciting the opening formulas as if they were prayers, steady, unwavering, without haste, invoking not new authority, but the same authority that had guided generations. The clerk unrolled the first scroll of the day, his voice even and calm, as he began to read reports from the provinces once more, beginning with Spain, where figures were given for the collection of olive oil and the transport of metals. Each number spoken clearly, each town listed, each expense recited, until the chamber seemed filled not with discussion, but with the cadence of accounting. When the Spain reports ended, the next scroll concerned Asia Minor, with notes about roads that required repair, bridges that had been damaged by storms, local officials requesting funds, and the expected revenues from harbor taxes. The words flowed steadily, not urgent, not dramatic, just continuous, like a stream that ran without end. Senators listened with quiet patience, for they knew that every detail, however repetitive, had to be preserved in record, not because decisions depended on it immediately, but because the process itself was the guarantee of continuity. Occasionally, one senator would rise to question a figure, perhaps suggesting that a shipment had been miscounted, or that a tax assessment required verification. His words, however, did not bring agitation, but merely introduced further repetition, for then the clerk would reread the line, others would nod, and more examples from earlier years would be cited to reinforce the importance of accuracy. The atmosphere remained steady, subdued, without sharp interruption. The younger senators, who might still harbor dreams of influence, watched the elders carefully, imitating their solemn gestures, their way of pausing before speaking, their habit of repeating what had already been said, as if repetition itself lent gravity. The chamber's pace was so slow that hours seemed to blend, and yet no one rushed, for rushing was foreign to the nature of the Senate. Decisions were not meant to be swift, but to unfold like a ritual, tested by delay, confirmed by endless recitation. As midday passed into afternoon, the reports shifted to matters of military supply, though even here there was no urgency of battle, only records of how many boots, shields, and spears had been requested, what quantities of grain were needed for marching legions, and whether the accounts matched the previous year. Each detail was read, noted, acknowledged, and then set aside, not concluded with decisive action, but absorbed into the flow of record-keeping. Lamps were lit as the light dimmed, casting long shadows that stretched across the benches, while still the voices carried on in the same rhythm, unbroken, steady, predictable. When at last the presiding magistrate brought the session to an end, the senators rose without surprise, as though ending was as inevitable as beginning, their faces marked not by triumph or frustration, but by the calm acceptance of duty fulfilled. They left the chamber quietly, their footsteps echoing softly, while the scrolls were rolled up again, tied with cords, and placed into storage, where they would join thousands of others that spoke of routine rather than drama. In the monotony of these proceedings lay the true character of the Senate, not swift power, but enduring process, not spectacle, but continuity. And it was this monotony that gave the institution its peculiar strength, a strength that seemed as immovable and unchanging as the very stones of the city itself. Another session of the Senate began as countless others had before, with the same careful process that unfolded so predictably, that anyone entering the chamber after years away would have recognized it immediately, for nothing in the atmosphere suggested urgency, only the slow certainty of repetition. The senators entered in small groups, the sound of their sandals faint against the marble floor, their robes gathered and arranged as they took their places, each movement calm, each gesture restrained. Attendants adjusted the benches, unrolled scrolls, and placed tablets at the ready, while scribes prepared to record proceedings that would fill yet another entry in the long and almost indistinguishable archives. The presiding magistrate rose, his voice steady, reciting the same opening formulas, acknowledging tradition, invoking order, setting the stage not for decision but for process. The first readings of the day were letters from governors in provinces scattered across the Mediterranean, each filled with practical matters that demanded acknowledgement but rarely inspired debate. Egypt reported on the shipments of grain, detailed down to the number of sacks loaded onto ships, the names of harbors, the schedules of departures. From North Africa came reports of tax collection, numbers of livestock counted, disputes between local leaders, requests for minor adjustments in assessments. From the eastern provinces came updates on markets, the tolls gathered at bridges, the condition of roads. The clerk read all of these with the same steady voice, line by line, without inflection, until the words became background noise to many of the senators, who listened passively, some nodding, some leaning back, some adjusting their garments to pass the time. When a senator rose to comment, his words were almost always couched in the same phrases: an acknowledgement of the ancestors, a reminder of precedent, a warning against haste. Rarely did anyone propose something new, for novelty was unwelcome. Instead, arguments circled around familiar ground, repeating principles already long established, confirming once again what had been confirmed countless times before. At intervals, debates touched upon finances, whether funds for repairs of aqueducts should be disbursed now or postponed until further verification, whether governors should be given leeway in their expenditures, whether provincial towns had fairly reported their dues. Yet even these discussions were prolonged not by passion, but by caution, for every assertion had to be met with a citation from earlier laws. Every suggestion weighed against precedents. Every decision delayed until the weight of procedure had exhausted all urgency. Hours slipped by, the steady murmur of voices filling the hall, the light from above shifting as the day wore on. Yet the atmosphere remained unchanged. The chamber seemed insulated from the life of the city outside, where merchants bargained, soldiers marched, and citizens crowded the forum. For within these walls, time was stretched into a slow procession of words and records. The younger senators, their energy checked by the example of the elders, learned quickly that patience was more valuable than rhetoric, endurance more useful than inspiration. The elders, in turn, reinforced the monotony by praising caution, reminding the chamber of past disasters supposedly caused by rashness, though the lessons had long ago become ritual phrases rather than urgent warnings. As the afternoon gave way to evening, lamps were lit, their faint glow joining the rhythm of the clerk's unbroken recitations. Scroll after scroll was read, each tied and set aside once its contents had been acknowledged, each added to the great store of records that seemed less like instruments of decision and more like symbols of the continuity of the Senate itself. When the presiding magistrate finally declared adjournment, the senators rose in silence, their movements unhurried, their faces calm, their steps echoing into the corridors as attendants rolled up the last documents and extinguished the lamps. Another day had passed, indistinguishable from the last, and the Senate stood unchanged, its strength not in action but in the steady monotony that gave the impression of stability across generations. The Senate gathered yet again, and with each repetition of its rituals, the chamber seemed to lose all distinction between one day and the next, as though time itself had become absorbed into the monotony of procedure. For the men who filled the benches did so without expectation of novelty, only the certainty of routine. The curia, unchanged in its solemn stone form, received them with the same cool air and faint echoes, while attendants carried out their duties in silence, unrolling scrolls, arranging writing tablets, and lighting the lamps even when daylight was still faintly visible through the high openings above. The presiding magistrate stood, his voice even and deliberate, repeating the formulas of order, invoking the authority of tradition, and opening yet another session that would unfold in the measured pattern everyone knew. The clerk began with reports from Sicily, describing harvests, tallying the measures of grain, listing the costs of transport and the names of officials who had overseen shipments to Rome. Each figure, each date, each location was spoken aloud slowly, recorded dutifully, and acknowledged formally, though none of it surprised the senators, who had heard such reports countless times before. From Sicily, the readings moved to Macedonia, where notes about minor repairs of roads and bridges, the allocation of funds for fortifications, and the movement of goods along trade routes were read in the same steady rhythm. The senators listened in silence, occasionally shifting in their seats, occasionally raising a hand to request a repetition of a line, but never altering the pace or the nature of the discourse. When one senator rose to speak, his words were predictable: praise for the diligence of the ancestors, reminders of past examples, warnings against haste, all expressed in tones of solemnity that carried weight not because of originality, but because of their conformity to tradition. Another senator followed, echoing the same ideas, his speech almost indistinguishable from the one before, so that the chamber became filled with repetition, layered upon repetition. Hours passed, yet the sense of progress was absent, for each topic blended into the next, each record added to the ever-growing archive that stored not decisions of urgency, but the traces of procedure itself. The monotony was broken only by minor disputes, such as whether a tax had been counted properly, or whether a messenger had delivered his report according to custom. Even these disputes did not bring energy but prolonged the routine, for once questions were raised, the clerk would reread sections, senators would cite precedents, and still more speeches would echo earlier points until the chamber returned to its rhythm of slow acknowledgement. Outside the Curia, the life of Rome surged with voices, movement, and color, but within the Senate everything slowed. The day stretched into long hours of voices that droned like distant waves. By the time the lamps were burning more brightly and shadows lengthened across the benches, the senators remained seated in calm endurance, their faces betraying no impatience, for they had accepted that the essence of their role was not to decide swiftly, but to endure steadily. When finally the presiding magistrate declared the session ended, there was no sign of relief, no sense of conclusion, only the quiet rising of men from benches, the adjusting of robes, the gathering of scrolls, and the soft shuffle of feet as they departed in silence. Attendants rolled up the documents, tied them with cords, and stored them among the countless records that filled the archives, each scroll a mirror of the ones before it. Thus the Senate continued, not by leaps of action, but by the monotony of continuity, its true strength lying in the unbroken repetition that made each day indistinguishable from the last, a rhythm as steady and unchanging as the stone walls that contained it. Once more the Roman Senate convened, and as the senators made their way into the Curia, it was as though the city outside had little bearing on the rhythm within, for the streets might bustle with traders, soldiers, and messengers, but inside the chamber the atmosphere remained heavy, cool, and utterly predictable, the same voices and the same gestures repeating themselves as they had done for generations. The benches creaked faintly as men settled into their familiar places, robes adjusted carefully over shoulders, scrolls balanced on laps, styluses held ready, though rarely used for anything beyond routine notes. Attendants moved quietly to ensure everything was in order, lamps trimmed though daylight was still present, wax tablets laid in neat rows, cords untied from the scrolls that would soon be read. The presiding magistrate rose slowly, voice unhurried, reciting the opening formulas with such steadiness that the words seemed less spoken than simply released into the air, as part of an ancient ritual that had long ceased to change. The clerk began with the day's agenda, a list of reports and petitions that sounded strikingly similar to those of the previous day, and indeed to the many days before, for it was not variety, but continuity that defined these gatherings. Reports from Campania detailed the maintenance of roads, the repair of aqueducts, the movement of goods to the capital, each item recited carefully, acknowledged with murmurs, and added to the record without excitement. From Asia came notes on market tolls and disputes among local magistrates, presented in the same tone, considered with the same gravity, and postponed for later review in the same way countless other items had been postponed. A senator rose to speak on the importance of fairness in tax collection, reminding his peers of the wisdom of the ancestors, recounting examples from earlier centuries. His words filling the hall with echoes of sentiments already expressed many times. Another followed with praise for caution, warning against rashness, speaking in such measured tones that his speech blended seamlessly with the one before, until the chamber was filled not with debate, but with repetition. The hours crept forward slowly, marked only by the shifting of shadows across the stone floor as the light above moved with the day. The monotone voice of the clerk continued, detailing shipments of grain, tallies of livestock, records of minor expenses. Figures that meant little in the moment but had to be spoken, preserved, and entered into scrolls as if the preservation itself were the true purpose. Some senators leaned back, their eyes half closed, as though caught between wakefulness and drifting thought, while others whispered in hushed tones, though never enough to disrupt the flow. Younger members waited their turn to speak, rehearsing arguments that when delivered sounded nearly identical to those already made, their eagerness subdued by the weight of decorum. The elders sat with calm patience, content to let the hours pass, their authority expressed not in passion, but in endurance. By the time the lamps burned brighter and the hall grew dim, the Senate remained in the same rhythm it had maintained since the opening, a rhythm of procedure, record, and repetition. When the presiding magistrate finally signaled the close, there was no surge of relief, no burst of conversation, only the slow gathering of scrolls, the adjusting of garments, the quiet steps of men leaving the chamber in orderly silence. Attendants tied the scrolls once again, carried them to storage, and extinguished the lamps one by one, leaving the curia in shadow. Another session had passed into memory, indistinguishable from the countless others, leaving behind nothing but the impression of continuity, the steady hum of process, the monotony that was both the burden and the strength of the Roman Senate. The Senate gathered again, and as the senators entered the curia, the familiar sense of inevitability filled the chamber, for each man knew that the day would unfold in the same slow rhythm as countless others before it, a rhythm shaped less by urgency than by the weight of tradition. The benches creaked faintly as they took their places, the sound of robes brushing against stone, the only accompaniment to the murmurs of greeting spoken in low, measured tones. Attendants unrolled scrolls, adjusted lamps, and arranged tablets with the same careful precision, while scribes prepared to record every word, not because novelty was expected, but because the act of recording itself preserved the illusion of progress. The presiding magistrate rose and repeated the opening formulas without variation, his voice calm, steady, unhurried, as though the words themselves had long ceased to belong to the speaker, and instead belonged to the Senate as an eternal chant. The clerk began to read, this time from reports concerning the provinces of Gaul, with figures on the harvest of grain, tallies of livestock, and accounts of taxes collected from towns along the rivers. Each item was read with the same cadence, each figure spoken clearly, each name entered into record, and the chamber absorbed it all without reaction. From Gaul, the readings moved to Crete, where notes on small disputes between local officials were presented, each described with care, each deferred for further consideration, none of them urgent, none of them pressing. Senators listened in silence, occasionally stirring to request that a line be repeated, occasionally offering a comment that reminded the chamber of precedent, always returning to the same themes of caution, fairness, and the wisdom of the ancestors. Younger senators stood when permitted, their speeches long rehearsed, yet indistinguishable from the voices of their elders, repeating points already made, circling the same arguments as though the repetition itself carried authority. Hours stretched on, the chamber filled with the hum of steady voices, the flicker of lamps, and the slow passage of time that seemed to thicken within the stone walls. Outside, life in Rome moved briskly, with merchants bargaining in the forum, messengers rushing with orders, and citizens going about their business. But within the Senate, everything unfolded with a deliberate slowness that seemed untouched by the world beyond. Minor disputes arose over the accuracy of figures, leading to rereadings of scrolls, debates over procedure, references to ancient examples, all of which prolonged the monotony without changing its nature. Even when matters of military supply were discussed, the urgency of war was dulled into lists of numbers, inventories of equipment, and comparisons to previous years. the language stripped of drama, reduced to steady accounting. As shadows grew long and the lamps glowed more brightly, the Senate still moved at its measured pace, the voices continuing as though no end were near. Yet eventually, as always, the presiding magistrate gave the signal, and the senators rose slowly, adjusting robes, collecting scrolls, departing with steps that echoed softly into the corridors. Attendants tied the scrolls once more, stored them with the countless others, and extinguished the lamps one by one until the chamber lay in silence and shadow. Nothing had changed. No decision had altered the course of the city, yet the Senate endured, its strength found not in action, but in the endless repetition of procedure, the monotony that ensured continuity, the ritual that made each day indistinguishable from the last. The Senate convened once more, and as the senators entered the chamber, it felt less like the beginning of a new day than the continuation of a single unending session. For every movement, every voice, every gesture followed the same familiar course that had been practiced for generations. The curia stood as always, its stone walls cool, its high ceiling echoing faintly with the sound of sandals and the rustle of robes, its benches arranged in orderly rows that had seen countless men sit and rise in the same steady rhythm. Attendants moved quietly to prepare the space, untying the cords of scrolls, trimming the wicks of lamps, arranging writing tablets, ensuring that everything was in place for proceedings that promised no surprises. The presiding magistrate rose, his tone calm and deliberate, repeating the opening invocation that carried no urgency, only the steady weight of tradition. The clerk began to read from the first scroll, this time concerning the affairs of the province of Illyricum, where notes on tax assessments, shipments of timber, and disputes between local officials filled the record. Each figure was read aloud, each name pronounced carefully, each line entered into the archive, while the senators listened in silence, acknowledging the words not with excitement, but with the quiet acceptance that such details must always be preserved. From Illyricum, the reports moved to Cyrene, with records of harvests, requests for funds to repair roads, and petitions from magistrates seeking approval for minor expenditures. These too were read in the same even tone, considered with the same solemn nods, and postponed for further discussion just as countless other matters had been postponed before. When senators rose to speak, their words carried the weight of formality, but little novelty, for they repeated the same principles heard day after day. The wisdom of the ancestors, the importance of fairness, the need for caution, the danger of haste. Each speech blended into the one before it, their arguments circling familiar ground, their gestures measured, their voices calm. Younger senators, eager to prove themselves, rose when permitted, yet their speeches, though longer, added nothing that had not already been said. And so the rhythm of repetition continued. The hours passed slowly, the light from above shifting across the stone floor, the voices of the chamber filling the air like a steady hum. Occasionally, disputes arose over the accuracy of figures or the correctness of a procedure, and these disputes, rather than adding energy, prolonged the monotony, for they required the clerk to reread lines, the senators to recall precedents, and the chamber to circle once more around points already considered. Matters of military provisioning were treated no differently, reduced to tallies of grain and inventories of equipment, spoken in the same tone as the repair of roads or the counting of livestock. As the day wore on, the lamps were lit, their faint glow adding to the atmosphere of timelessness, while the clerk's voice continued, unbroken, steady, as if it might go on indefinitely. When at last the presiding magistrate declared the session adjourned, there was no relief, only the quiet rising of men from their benches, the slow adjustment of robes, the gathering of scrolls, and the soft shuffle of feet as they departed in silence. Attendants rolled the scrolls once again, tied them neatly, and carried them to storage, where they joined the endless rows of records that preserved not decisive action, but the steady flow of procedure. The lamps were extinguished one by one until the chamber was dark, leaving behind only the impression of continuity, the sense that tomorrow and the day after and all the days to come would unfold in the same rhythm. The Senate endured not through passion or drama, but through monotony, a monotony so complete that it became timeless, a monotony that gave the Republic its peculiar strength, unchanging and eternal, as steady as the stone that enclosed it. That concludes our previous story. Before we move on, may I kindly ask you to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you will never miss the nights of quiet history to come. And now let us continue our journey through boring history for sleep as we arrive at the next tale, the administrative boredom of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, vast in territory and layered in bureaucracy, functioned less as a stage for dramatic events and more as an endless routine of paperwork, decrees, ledgers, and quiet discussions that unfolded in dimly lit offices, where the pace of life slowed into a rhythm of repetition. To imagine the empire's administration is not to see sultans in glittering robes commanding armies, but rather scribes bent over long tables, their reed pens scratching steadily across sheets of paper, recording taxes, cataloging shipments, copying decrees that would be sent to provincial governors, who themselves would forward them to local officials. The day began with the arrival of clerks, who arranged inkpots and sharpened pens, unrolled long sheets of parchment, and stacked registers that contained accounts of grain, livestock, and coin collected from distant provinces. Reports were sorted into neat piles, and the head scribes began to read them aloud in flat tones, reciting the numbers of cattle recorded in Anatolia, the taxes owed by merchants in the bazaars of Damascus, the tolls collected at bridges in the Balkans. Each figure was spoken clearly, written carefully, and then checked against earlier entries to ensure no mistake had crept in. The work carried no drama, only the steady hum of routine, and the men engaged in it showed little emotion beyond the calm persistence required to move from one line to the next. Provincial governors sent long lists of expenses, and these were read in full, noting the wages of guards, the repair of roads, the costs of maintaining caravansaries, the fees paid to artisans. Each item was logged, verified, stamped with seals, and placed into the archive, where it would rest alongside thousands of others, rarely to be consulted again, but preserved because the act of preservation itself was the essence of administration. The pace was slow, and hours could pass as clerks copied line after line, their hands steady, their voices steady, their minds dulled by repetition but held firm by duty. When disputes arose, they were rarely about policy, but about the accuracy of numbers, the spelling of a name, the placement of a seal. These disputes could consume hours, for each error had to be corrected with reference to earlier documents. Witnesses called to confirm figures, signatures compared against stored samples, until the chamber was satisfied that the records were exact. Outside, the empire stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Hungary, but inside the chancery, the empire existed only as columns of numbers and lists of names, an empire of ink and parchment where time moved not in battles or conquests, but in the slow accretion of records. The voices of clerks rose and fell in monotonous cadence, reading aloud decrees that confirmed earlier decrees, revising tax rates only slightly, postponing decisions until further review. The cycle repeated endlessly, for once reports were finished, another set would arrive, and once decrees were copied, they would be recopied for transmission, and once records were stored, they would be retrieved to check against new reports. The lamps smoked faintly, the ink stained fingers, the parchment curled at the edges, and still the work went on, day after day, year after year, the same routines performed by generations of scribes who replaced one another without altering the rhythm. What gave the empire its strength was not swift command, but the monotony of its administration, the endless recording and confirming that gave a sense of stability to a realm so vast it might otherwise have dissolved into chaos. In the silence of offices filled with scrolls and ledgers, the empire was maintained not by swords, but by pens, not by passion, but by procedure, not by sudden decisions, but by the steady hum of administration that repeated itself until it seemed timeless, a monotony that preserved power by slowing it into continuity. The next day in the Ottoman chancery unfolded with the same deliberate rhythm that had defined the previous one, for the empire's machinery of administration was not built on sudden changes, but on the repetition of endless processes that preserved the illusion of order across vast and varied lands. The clerks arrived early, their steps soft against the stone floors, their robes gathered neatly as they entered the long halls lined with shelves of ledgers, each shelf stacked with volumes so similar in appearance that they seemed to blur into one another, year upon year of figures and decrees bound together in the monotony of record-keeping. The morning began with the recitation of reports that had arrived overnight, carried by couriers who had ridden across provinces to deliver documents sealed with wax. Their contents rarely urgent, but always recorded with the same care. The first scroll concerned the markets of Bursa, where the prices of silk, wool, and cotton had been tallied, and where the taxes on merchants were carefully listed by name and amount. Each name was read aloud by the clerk in a steady, unchanging voice, and each figure was copied again into the central registers. The numbers checked against previous years, compared, and verified. From Bursa, the attention turned to reports from Aleppo, describing caravans that had arrived from the east, the quantities of spices they carried, the duties paid at the city gates, the disputes between merchants over weights and measures. These too were written into the record, sealed, and set aside, their significance less in the events themselves than in the fact that they had been noted, preserved, and added to the chain of documentation that bound the empire together. Hours passed as the readings continued, the monotone of the clerk's voice filling the chamber while scribes bent over their desks, their pens scratching steadily as they copied line after line of text without variation. Occasionally, the head of the chancery would pause to ask for a figure to be repeated, or to inquire whether a particular seal matched the one on record, and this small disruption would be enough to occupy the room for a long stretch of time, as the clerk searched through earlier volumes, compared handwriting, and confirmed that no error had been made. Such matters rarely produced conclusions of substance, yet the very act of checking, rechecking, and confirming gave the appearance of diligence, and diligence was the essence of Ottoman administration. The afternoon brought petitions from provincial governors requesting funds for repairs to fortifications, bridges, and caravan routes, each request accompanied by lists of expenses that were read in full, down to the number of stones used in construction, the wages of each laborer, the cost of each nail. Senators in Rome might have debated principles, but in Istanbul the scribes focused on numbers, each detail recited with care, each entry copied with patience, until the work became less a matter of decision and more a ritual of endurance. As the sun lowered and the lamps were lit, the air grew heavier with the smell of oil and ink, and still the clerks worked, their voices steady, their hands moving with the same mechanical persistence. By the time the head magistrate declared the session over, the piles of parchment had shifted only slightly, one set of reports replaced by another, one register closed while another awaited entry, yet the empire was said to have been governed for another day. The men filed out in silence, their robes brushing softly against the stone, leaving behind a hall filled with documents, scrolls tied and shelved, lamps dimmed one by one until only the faint glow of embers remained. Nothing dramatic had happened. No decree had altered the course of history, yet the monotony itself was the guarantee of continuity, the slow, steady hum of administration that preserved the Ottoman Empire through the passing of years. One document, one entry, one day at a time. Another day of Ottoman administration began with the same quiet procession of clerks, entering the chancery halls, their footsteps measured, their faces calm, their movements steady as they arranged desks, sharpened pens, and unrolled fresh sheets of parchment to continue the work that seemed never to end. The shelves around them held thousands of volumes filled with accounts of previous years, their bindings identical, their contents nearly indistinguishable, a sea of numbers and names that stretched backward in time like an unbroken thread of repetition. The presiding official opened the session with the usual invocation of duty, his tone without urgency, for everyone in the chamber already knew that the tasks before them would mirror those of yesterday and those of tomorrow. The first report was from Cairo, describing the collection of grain taxes along the Nile, each village listed, each measure of grain recorded, each tax in coin or kind carefully noted. The clerk read every line aloud, his voice flat and steady, while scribes copied the figures into the master registers, their reed pens scratching softly in unison, as though guided by the same invisible hand. Once the Cairo reports were completed, attention shifted to Salonika, where records detailed the flow of goods through the harbor, the arrival of ships carrying wool, the duties paid on their cargo, the salaries of the dock workers, the costs of repairing mooring posts. Each item was read with equal weight, as if the smallest expenditure carried the same importance as the largest, for the act of documentation itself was what mattered most. Hours passed with little change, the monotone voices, and the steady scratching of pens, creating a rhythm that lulled even the most attentive minds into a state of quiet endurance. Occasionally, a discrepancy was noted, perhaps a missing figure or a smudged seal, and the clerks would rise from their benches to search through earlier scrolls, comparing handwriting, checking seals against wax impressions stored in wooden boxes, until the error was resolved not by decision but by confirmation of what was already known. Such interruptions did not add energy to the proceedings, but only extended their duration, reinforcing the monotony with further layers of procedure. The afternoon brought petitions from distant governors in Anatolia, each requesting funds for roads, schools, or fortifications, each accompanied by long lists of expenses that were read in full, including the wages of stonemasons, the purchase of timber, and the costs of feeding laborers. None of these petitions were resolved immediately. Instead, they were acknowledged, copied, stamped, and deferred for later review, just as countless petitions before had been treated. The cycle of reading, recording, and postponing continued, with no sense of urgency, no expectation of finality, only the slow accumulation of paper that gave the empire its peculiar strength. Outside the chancery, the empire was alive with voices, markets, and movement, but inside the chamber the hours thickened into a haze of ink and words. As the sun declined and the lamps were lit, shadows stretched across the walls, yet the clerks continued at the same pace, their voices unchanged, their hands steady, their eyes fixed on the endless lines of text. When at last the presiding official declared the day's work complete, the men rose in silence, gathered their tools, and filed out as quietly as they had entered, leaving behind the shelves stacked with fresh volumes, indistinguishable from the ones before, destined to join the archive of monotony that was the foundation of Ottoman governance. Nothing remarkable had occurred. No sudden decree had altered the empire, yet the monotony itself was the guarantee of order, a rhythm so steady that it carried the empire forward one day at a time, one record at a time, one repetition after another. The day's proceedings in the Ottoman chancery began as they always did, with clerks filing into the long hall, whose shelves of ledgers stretched endlessly in every direction, each volume a mirror of the next, each entry indistinguishable except for the names of distant towns and the dates carefully written at the top of each page. The atmosphere was hushed, broken only by the sound of sandals on stone and the rustle of parchment as attendants prepared the documents for another cycle of reading and recording. Lamps were trimmed even though daylight filtered faintly through narrow windows, their glow adding a constant dimness that matched the unhurried mood of the chamber. The presiding officer began with the same invocation of duty, his voice steady, the words identical to those spoken on countless other mornings, words that no longer stirred thought but simply marked the beginning of another day. The first reports were from Damascus, describing the flow of caravans that passed through the city gates, listing their loads of spices, textiles, and precious stones, each merchant's name written carefully, each duty noted in figures, each total verified against earlier records. The clerk read each line with deliberate slowness, while scribes copied every number into registers, their pens scratching at the same pace as if keeping rhythm with the voice that guided them. Once Damascus was complete, the attention shifted to Baghdad, where records detailed irrigation canals, the distribution of water to fields, the fees paid by farmers, the costs of maintenance, the names of workers employed to keep the system functioning. Every detail, however small, was entered into the record, confirmed aloud, stamped with seals, and placed into the growing archive. The routine unfolded without variation, and as hours slipped by, the sound of recitation merged with the scratching of pens into a steady hum that seemed to exist outside of time. Discrepancies, when they appeared, became the focus of long stretches, as clerks paused to check older scrolls, to compare seals, to recite precedents that stretched back decades, until at last the matter was resolved with little more than the repetition of what had already been said. Such matters added no energy, only extended the rhythm, prolonging the monotony in which the empire found its sense of stability. The afternoon was given to petitions from governors in the Balkans, where requests for funds to repair bridges, to build fortifications, or to maintain caravan stations were read in full, each itemized down to the cost of nails and the wages of guards. These too were acknowledged, copied, and deferred, not settled with decisive action, but folded into the endless cycle of postponement that characterized imperial administration. Younger clerks, still eager to prove themselves, read with careful precision, mimicking the tone of their elders, while older men nodded slowly, reinforcing the lesson that in administration it was not brilliance but endurance that mattered. Outside the chancery, the life of the city moved swiftly, merchants calling out prices, ships unloading cargo, citizens rushing through crowded streets, but within the stone walls of the chancery time seemed suspended, its passage marked only by the turning of pages and the burning down of lamps. As evening approached and the air grew heavy with the smell of oil and ink, the clerks continued, their voices unchanged, their hands steady, their eyes fixed on endless columns of numbers that carried no drama yet demanded constant attention. At last, the presiding officer declared the session closed, and the men gathered their tools, rolled up the completed scrolls, and filed out in silence, leaving the chamber once again to its rows of ledgers. The scrolls were tied with cords, sealed, and placed among thousands of others, indistinguishable in form, part of a record that stretched into eternity. Nothing remarkable had been decided. No decree had reshaped the empire, yet the monotony of administration itself was its strength. The slow, steady rhythm of procedure that carried the empire forward, not through dramatic change, but through the enduring weight of repetition. Another morning in the administrative halls of the Ottoman Empire began with the same deliberate procession of clerks entering the chancery, their sandals tapping lightly against stone floors, their robes gathered neatly as they moved to their benches with calm precision. Each one aware that the work awaiting them would differ little from what had occupied their hands and voices the day before. The walls of the hall were lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of ledgers, each ledger filled with lists of names, figures, and decrees. A vast archive that gave the impression of stability through sheer volume rather than novelty. Lamps were trimmed, inkpots filled, pens sharpened, and parchment unrolled, all with the practiced ease of men who had repeated these actions countless times, so many times that their hands seemed to move without conscious thought. The presiding official began the session with the same formal invocation, words delivered in a tone that was neither urgent nor inspired, but steady and predictable, signaling that the day's cycle of reading and recording had officially begun. The first scroll of the day carried reports from the province of Anatolia, where villages had submitted their yearly accounts of wheat, barley, and sheep, each figure carefully written by local scribes and now repeated in the capital, line by line, without pause or emphasis. The clerk's voice carried steadily across the hall, and the scribes bent to their task of copying each number into central registers, their pens scratching softly, their posture unchanged, their expressions calm and unreadable. Once the Anatolian accounts were completed, the next set of reports concerned the markets of Edirne, listing duties collected from merchants selling cloth, spices, and livestock, the disputes between traders over measures and weights, the fees for stalls in the bazaar, all recited in the same unbroken monotone, all preserved in the same style of ledger entries. Hours passed, marked only by the slow shifting of light across the chamber, and yet the rhythm of reading, copying, and verifying remained unaltered. When discrepancies appeared, as they inevitably did, they were treated not with drama, but with careful slowness. Seals were compared against impressions stored in wax, handwriting was checked against earlier samples. Older ledgers were pulled from the shelves to confirm past figures, and once the issue was resolved, the cycle resumed without change. In the afternoon came petitions from governors in distant provinces, some requesting funds for the repair of aqueducts, others listing expenses for garrisons or caravan stations. Each item read aloud in full, down to the cost of nails, bricks, or the wages of each guard. These petitions were acknowledged, copied, stamped, and then deferred for later consideration, exactly as so many petitions had been treated before. Younger clerks, eager to demonstrate skill, imitated the careful tone of their elders, while the older men nodded slowly, reinforcing the lesson that true authority in administration lay not in innovation, but in persistence. Outside, the city bustled with life, the markets of Istanbul overflowing with noise and color, ships docking in the Golden Horn, people shouting, bargaining, and moving quickly through narrow streets. But inside the chancery time seemed suspended, its flow reduced to the steady pace of recitation and the faint glow of lamps. By the time evening approached, the air was thick with the smell of oil and ink. The shadows lengthened across the stone floor, and yet the clerks continued at the same measured pace, voices steady, hands unshaken, eyes fixed on endless columns of numbers and names. At last, the presiding official declared the session closed, and the men rose quietly, rolled up the scrolls, tied them with cords, and carried them to the shelves where they would join thousands of others that looked exactly the same, indistinguishable in form and content. Lamps were extinguished one by one, the chamber dimmed into silence, and another day of administration ended as countless others had before, not with decisions of great consequence, but with the weight of monotony, the very monotony that preserved the empire's stability, holding together its vastness by the endless repetition of procedure. Another day unfolded within the Ottoman chancery, and as always, the pace of life inside those stone walls bore little resemblance to the noise and movement of the world outside. For the chancery existed in its own slow rhythm, a rhythm made of parchment, ink, seals, and the endless repetition of procedures. The clerks entered quietly, each moving to his appointed place, without need for instruction, for habit guided them as much as duty. They placed ink pots in careful rows, sharpened pens with deliberate patience, unrolled parchment that curled at the edges, and arranged stacks of ledgers that seemed to stretch backward endlessly in time. The shelves that lined the walls were filled with documents so numerous that their weight alone gave the impression of permanence. Though the contents of one volume differed little from another, the presiding official opened the session with the same formula, invoking the empire's duty to maintain order and stability, though the words carried no urgency, only the comfort of repetition. And all present knew they marked not a new beginning, but the continuation of what had been done countless times before. The first reports were from the province of Rumelia, describing the collection of grain and livestock taxes from small villages. Each name read aloud, each figure copied into registers, each total verified against earlier records. The clerk's voice was steady, unchanging, and the scribes bent their heads as they copied line after line, the scratch of their pens merging with the sound of recitation into a single background hum. When the Rumelian accounts were complete, attention shifted to Cyprus, where reports detailed the arrival of ships carrying salt and timber, the tolls paid by merchants, and the maintenance costs of harbors and warehouses. These were read without emphasis, copied with patience, sealed with wax, and placed in the archive where they would sit alongside thousands of similar records. Hours passed with little variation, the only interruptions coming when a discrepancy was noticed, perhaps a number that failed to match an earlier entry, or a seal that looked faintly irregular. Such moments required long stretches of checking, as older scrolls were retrieved, wax impressions compared, handwriting analyzed, until at last the matter was resolved in favor of the record, and the session returned to its steady rhythm. By midday, petitions from governors were introduced, each filled with long lists of expenses for bridges, schools, and caravan stations, each read aloud in full, each acknowledged, copied, and deferred. No decision was final, for nothing was ever final. Everything was postponed, checked and rechecked, creating the illusion of diligence through the monotony of delay. The younger clerks read carefully, imitating the measured tone of their superiors, while the elders nodded gravely, their experience reinforcing the lesson that persistence mattered more than brilliance, that the strength of administration lay not in creativity, but in the endurance of procedure. Outside the chancery, the city of Istanbul pulsed with voices, markets, and movement. But within the hall, time slowed until hours felt indistinguishable, the day marked only by the gradual dimming of light and the flickering of lamps. As evening came, the air grew heavy with the smell of oil and ink. Yet the clerks continued with the same steady pace, their eyes on the parchment, their hands unshaken, their voices calm. When at last the presiding official declared the session over, the men rose slowly, gathered their scrolls, tied them with cords, and placed them carefully on the shelves, where they blended seamlessly with the countless others already there. Lamps were extinguished one by one, the chamber grew dim, and silence settled over the rows of ledgers. Another day had ended, yet nothing had changed, for the monotony itself was the empire's guarantee of order, a monotony that stretched across provinces and across generations, binding the Ottoman world together in the slow and steady rhythm of administration. The Ottoman chancery opened its doors yet again, and the pattern of the day followed so precisely the rhythm of the previous ones that it seemed less like a new event and more like the continuation of a single, unending process that had stretched backward for centuries and promised to stretch forward in the same way. The clerks arrived in silence, their robes brushing softly against the stone floors as they moved to their benches, each man already knowing exactly where to sit, exactly how to arrange his tools, and exactly how the day would unfold. Ink pots were placed in neat rows, pens sharpened with slow precision, parchment unrolled with care, and stacks of ledgers arranged at hand's reach. The shelves that lined the hall loomed with their endless weight of documents, each volume indistinguishable from the next, each filled with names and numbers that merged together in the mind until they formed a haze of record-keeping that had no beginning and no end. The presiding official gave the opening invocation, his voice calm, slow, and perfectly predictable, words that no longer inspired thought, but simply marked the transition from waiting to working, a ritual as much a part of the empire as the stones of the city itself. The first scroll of the day came from the province of Bosnia, filled with records of livestock tallies, tax payments, and village disputes over grazing rights. Each item was read aloud line by line, in a voice that carried neither emphasis nor variation, and the scribes bent over their desks to copy each figure into the master registers, their pens scratching softly in rhythm with the recitation. When the Bosnian accounts were completed, the work moved on to reports from the island of Rhodes, where harbors collected tolls from incoming ships, each vessel listed by name, each cargo measured and taxed, each fee recorded with such detail that it seemed the weight of administration rested not on decisions, but on the act of documenting itself. Hours passed, the sound of the clerk's voice blending with the steady scratching of pens into a background murmur that lulled thought into quiet submission. Occasionally a discrepancy appeared, perhaps a miswritten number, a faint seal, or a missing line, and these small errors were enough to fill long stretches of time, as older ledgers were retrieved from shelves, wax impressions compared, handwriting examined, until the matter was resolved with slow certainty. Nothing was changed by these checks, yet the act of checking itself was valued, for it gave the appearance of diligence and reinforced the rhythm of monotony that bound the empire together. By the afternoon, petitions from governors in distant provinces were read, each filled with lists of expenses for bridges, warehouses, and caravanserais, each item described in full, each cost broken down to the smallest coin, and every petition acknowledged, copied, stamped, and deferred. Younger clerks practiced their reading with exaggerated care, their voices carefully measured, while the elders listened with calm approval, teaching through example that patience and endurance mattered far more than originality. Outside, the city of Istanbul carried on with its noise and energy, markets alive with bargaining, ships unloading in the Golden Horn, people hurrying through crowded streets, but inside the chancery time slowed until hours became indistinguishable, marked only by the gradual dimming of daylight and the glow of oil lamps. As evening approached, the clerks continued at the same pace, their voices unchanged, their hands steady, their eyes focused on the endless columns of text. Finally, the presiding official declared the day concluded, and the men rose in silence, tied the scrolls with cords, placed them on the shelves, and extinguished the lamps one by one. The chamber darkened, the silence deepened, and another day of administration joined the countless others already past, indistinguishable in memory, preserved only in the endless monotony of documents. Nothing dramatic had occurred, no decree altered the course of history, yet the empire endured, its strength resting in the very monotony that slowed life into continuity, turning repetition into permanence and boredom into stability. The following day in the administrative halls of the Ottoman Empire began with the same slow rhythm that had carried countless other days before it, for the chancery was less a place of decision and more a place of repetition, where continuity itself was the true work of governance. The clerks entered as they always did, their steps quiet on the stone floors, their robes gathered carefully, their movements steady and practiced, as though the weight of centuries had shaped their every gesture. Ink pots were placed in precise rows, pens sharpened with deliberate patience, parchment unrolled and smoothed across wooden desks, and registers stacked neatly so that the day's labor could proceed without interruption. The presiding official rose to give the formal invocation, his voice calm and unhurried, reciting the same words that had opened the sessions of his predecessors, words that by now carried no urgency, but instead served as a signal that the cycle of monotony had resumed once again. The first scroll came from the province of Armenia, its contents filled with long lists of grain deliveries, livestock counts, and tax receipts from mountain villages. Each figure was read aloud by the clerk, his tone steady and flat, while scribes bent over their desks to copy the entries into master ledgers, their pens moving in unison like instruments of a single endless rhythm. Once the Armenian reports were finished, the session turned to Crete, where harbor tolls and shipping fees were documented, each ship listed by name, each cargo weighed, each coin of duty recorded in detail. These too were read without variation, written carefully into the registers, stamped with seals, and added to the growing pile of records that lined the shelves like an ocean of ink and parchment. Hours passed with little sense of progress, the sound of the clerk's monotone voice and the scratching of pens blending into a steady hum that seemed to stretch time itself. Discrepancies, when they appeared, became long episodes of checking and rechecking. As older scrolls were retrieved from shelves, wax seals compared against impressions stored in boxes, and handwriting scrutinized until the matter was resolved in favor of the record. Such disputes did not inject energy but deepened the monotony, for the act of reviewing itself was performed with the same patience and the same slowness as the rest of the work. In the afternoon, petitions from provincial governors were read aloud, each petition filled with line after line of expenses. The wages of guards, the purchase of timber, the cost of repairing bridges, the price of candles for watchtowers. Every item was spoken in full, every figure recorded, every petition acknowledged and then postponed for later review, as though the postponement itself was part of the empire's method of governance. Younger clerks read with careful voices, imitating the measured tone of their elders, while older scribes nodded gravely, reminding them by example that endurance was valued more than invention. Outside, the city of Istanbul continued its lively rhythm, markets filled with shouting merchants and bustling crowds, ships unloading goods into the Golden Horn, children running through narrow streets. But inside the chancery, the pace slowed to a crawl, the hours marked only by the gradual dimming of daylight and the flickering of lamps. As evening fell, the clerks still worked with steady hands, their voices calm, their eyes fixed on endless columns of numbers and names. At last, the presiding official signaled the close of the day, and the men rose in silence, tying scrolls with cords, stacking them carefully on shelves, extinguishing the lamps one by one until the hall grew dark and still. Nothing had been decided, nothing dramatic had occurred, yet the empire endured, its stability resting not on sudden decrees, but on the monotony of administration, a monotony that bound provinces together across distance and time, transforming boredom into permanence and procedure into power. Another day passed in the chancery of the Ottoman Empire, and as always, the routine began before the city outside had fully awakened, for the clerks and scribes moved according to a schedule that cared little for the noise of markets or the rush of ships in the harbor, instead following the slow and deliberate rhythm of record-keeping that defined imperial life. The long stone hall with its shelves of ledgers and its rows of desks received them with the same cool stillness, broken only by the faint echo of sandals on stone and the rustle of robes as each man took his appointed place. Inkwells were filled, pens sharpened, parchment smoothed and laid out, and scrolls carried from their storage to await the day's reading. The presiding officer opened the session with the customary invocation, his voice calm and deliberate, repeating words that had been spoken so often they seemed to belong more to the walls themselves than to the man who pronounced them. The clerk then began with reports from the province of Syria, detailing caravans arriving through desert routes, the quantities of dates and spices transported, the tolls collected at gates, and the disputes between merchants over weights and measures. Each line was read in full, without emphasis or variation, while scribes bent over their desks to copy the details into ledgers, their pens scratching softly in a rhythm that matched the drone of the reader's voice. Once the Syrian accounts were completed, the attention shifted to Albania, where records listed the taxes levied on shepherds, the tallies of sheep and goats, the repair of mountain roads, and the wages of guards assigned to keep them safe. Again, the voice of the clerk moved steadily. Again, the scribes copied. Again, the entries were sealed and set aside to join the thousands already filling the shelves. Hours passed without drama, the hall filled with the steady hum of routine, the same voices repeating the same procedures in an endless cycle of continuity. When discrepancies were noticed, they created not urgency, but further monotony, for every irregular figure required a return to older records, the untying of cords from earlier scrolls, the comparison of seals, the checking of signatures, until the error was resolved and the reading resumed in its unchanging pace. In the afternoon, petitions arrived from governors in distant provinces, their requests filled with long lists of expenses for roads, fortresses, mosques, and caravanserais. Each item was read aloud with care, each expense described in exact figures, down to the cost of lime for mortar or the purchase of nails for wooden gates. The petitions were acknowledged, copied, stamped, and postponed, folded into the endless chain of documents that seemed to preserve the empire, not by action but by recording. Younger clerks learned their trade by reading aloud in steady voices, while the elders corrected their tone with subtle nods, reinforcing that monotony itself was the essence of order. Outside, the city continued with its lively rhythm, the cries of merchants echoing in the bazaars, ships unloading cargo, and citizens hurrying through narrow streets. But inside, the chancery time seemed slowed, hours blending into one another, the day measured only by the gradual shift of shadows and the burning down of oil in the lamps. As evening fell, the clerks continued with the same steadiness, their eyes fixed on columns of names and numbers, their hands moving at the same measured pace. At last, the presiding officer gave the signal that the session was concluded, and the men rose in silence, rolling up the scrolls, tying them with cords, placing them carefully on shelves, and extinguishing the lamps one by one. The chamber fell into darkness, its shelves heavy with records that differed little from those of the day before, yet together formed the weight of permanence. Nothing had been changed, no decree altered the course of history, but the monotony itself endured, and in that endurance lay the true stability of the empire, a rhythm of ink and parchment that carried across generations, without pause. The final day of this long sequence in the Ottoman chancery began exactly as all the others had, without surprise, without haste, and without variation, for the essence of administration was not found in decisive action, but in the steady repetition of processes that gave the empire its peculiar rhythm. The clerks entered the stone hall in silence, their sandals echoing faintly, their robes swaying with the same calm movements that had guided generations before them. Inkwells were filled with deliberate care, pens sharpened, parchment unrolled across the wooden desks, and registers stacked so that the day could begin without interruption. The presiding official stood to deliver the customary invocation, his voice steady and unchanging, words that had been spoken so many times that they no longer belonged to a single moment, but to the continuity of centuries. The clerk unrolled the first scroll, beginning with reports from the province of Hungary, listing tax receipts from villages, the numbers of cattle and sheep, the tolls collected from markets, and the costs of repairing fortresses along the frontier. Each figure was read aloud with the same even tone, each entry copied by scribes into the great registers, their pens moving with patient steadiness, their expressions calm, their posture unchanged. When Hungary was finished, attention shifted to Egypt, where the flow of grain along the Nile was recorded in meticulous detail, every sack counted, every shipment noted, every payment confirmed. These figures, too, were read aloud, copied, sealed, and stored, joining the countless others already preserved on the shelves. Hours passed without change, the drone of voices and the scratching of pens merging into a background hum that seemed to stretch time into a haze of monotony. Discrepancies were noticed, as they always were, and each one became the subject of long stretches of checking and rechecking, seals compared, handwriting scrutinized, older scrolls retrieved from storage, until the matter was resolved without urgency, and the cycle resumed. In the afternoon, petitions were presented from distant governors, each filled with endless lists of expenses, repairs to bridges, wages for guards, purchases of stone and timber, provisions for caravans, and salaries for scribes. Every item was read aloud, every cost entered into the record, every petition acknowledged and postponed, folded into the unending rhythm of delay that defined governance. The younger clerks, their voices carefully measured, learned to embrace the monotony, while the elders nodded gravely, teaching through example that administration was not about brilliance or passion, but about endurance and repetition. Outside, the empire lived with noise, color, and movement, yet within the chancery, the day crept forward at the same unchanging pace, its hours marked only by the shifting of shadows and the dim glow of oil lamps. As evening came, the clerks continued with the same calm persistence, their hands moving, their voices steady, their eyes fixed on endless lines of text. At last, the presiding officer signaled the close of the day, and the men rose quietly, rolled up the scrolls, tied them with cords, and placed them carefully on the shelves. One by one, the lamps were extinguished, and the chamber returned to silence and shadow. The shelves now held another day's worth of records, indistinguishable from those of yesterday and those of tomorrow, yet together forming the weight of continuity. Nothing dramatic had occurred, no decree had reshaped the empire, but the monotony itself had carried the work forward, as it always had and always would. In this endless repetition lay the strength of the Ottoman state, a strength built not on sudden action, but on the slow, steady hum of administration, where boredom became permanence, where procedure became power, and where the empire endured not through drama, but through the quiet stability of monotony. Thank you so much for spending your time with Sleep Whisper tonight. As you drift into rest, remember, avoid heavy meals right before bed, and try to set your phone aside for a while so your mind can truly relax. When morning comes, may you wake with lightness, luck, and success. Sweet dreams, and I will see you again tomorrow night at Sleep Whisper.